Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Composer's Journey from Inspiration to Creation. My name is Dylan Townley. I'm a musician and composer, and our guest on Composer's Journey is Aaron Buckley-Mantell. We are talking about your piece, Flight of the Seeds. In episode 1, we covered some of the inspiration behind the piece, the idea that came to you while you were riding your bike, and the voice note that you recording some of the ideas, the textures, the inspiration, some of the melodic shapes. And then we also talked a bit about how you started to develop the piece by watching footage of seeds detaching from branches and plants and falling, being carried through the wind, and taking some of those visual and cinematic cues which relate to your work as a film composer, and applying them sort of the other way around, so that the film and movement and vision was starting to inform some of the musical ideas, but with that freedom of being able to close the YouTube tab and just compose for yourself as well, and take ideas where they were leading you. So yeah, we talked about some of those early inspirations and the concepts behind the piece, and the theme of episode 2 is first notes, which is starting to put the proverbial pen to paper, or to put the mouse click to your recording software and your notation software, and developing the first bits of score, the first fragments of texture and what is played by the orchestra, which can be a bit of a jump from that initial feeling and that sense of color. What was it like to sit down at your computer? I'm imagining this is a short time after you've got in from your bicycle journey. Could be minutes or hours, maybe it's even days, but the seed, as it were, of this idea has been sort of germinating in your mind, and now you're sitting down to start writing. What does that feel like? What's going through your mind when you're traveling from the idea that has arrived in your mind to making, and starting to think about what each section of the orchestra is actually playing?
I think the first thing was that the place where I wanted to start with the piece of music was to capture the sound of the wind, capture the sound of a gentle breeze, and the many different forms it takes, because the wind is the carrying force for the seed. Whatever journey it goes on, it's not going there on its own accord. It's being taken there by this third party, essentially, by this other force. And so it was really important for me that was the place where I started with the music. And I think I've got some early versions here which didn't make it into the piece of music in the end. So the very first idea was not the idea which I ended up with at all, really. And I think early on I was a bit too obsessed with the idea of how other people had done this, created this sound of the wind, and was trying to emulate something similar to what they had done before, and thinking, which in some ways is an interesting way to go, because you're like, oh, I know what works. But the thing is, I hadn't done that before. I hadn't created it. Someone else had created it. And so in a similar way to, you're just thinking about different techniques that the person is using. So, if you're looking at, as an artist, the different way that a painter paints, then, you're not necessarily creating the same image, but you're thinking about the different techniques that they're using in order to create that painting. And I think that the idea that I came up with initially, I was really obsessed with it. I really wanted it to be the idea, but ultimately it wasn't. And there did come a point eventually where the idea had to sort of let go of this idea, and you'll see perhaps similarities between this and what appears in the final piece, but they're not necessarily the similarities where I originally intended them to be. So I'll play you this little piano clip first of all, and then I'll talk about it. So that was my first idea. And it was very much inspired by, if you think about fast flurries of notes, then the music that I quoted as my inspiration in the voice note was John Williams' Harry Potter music, where he has these amazing string runs, which are sort of flurrying around the actual melody. And similarly, some of the string runs in the Matrix music, which is quite furious, really. And I was quite obsessed with that sound, I think, and I wanted to kind of create something similar myself. But I think that whilst, yes, it does, when it's played on the piano, it does create this nice sort of airy, floaty feeling, but it doesn't. I tried sort of translating it into the orchestra, and I just didn't manage to find a way for it to fit, no matter how hard I tried, because there's many versions where I tried to do it. And also, I think ultimately, like, there's a small phrase of music that is, and after that, I was like, where does it go after this point? And I did, and I explored different ways after that point, but didn't really go anywhere particularly with it. I'll show you. This is a version where I tried to orchestrate it into sort of the violins playing the melody line. So it has this kind of wispy feeling to it, I suppose, which is probably not what I was trying to create. I think the gentle breeze that I came up with in the end, it's not necessarily wispy. That one kind of feels a little bit more aggressive and a bit more blurry like than the actual sound that I ended up going with. And I think, yeah, ultimately it's faster than the sound that I wanted. Let me play you another little clip where I tried to take it in another direction. So yes, again, it's kind of a building on that original quick melody that I've got there. And I think that whilst that's not the ultimate place I ended up going, the sound in the strings is a little bit more in the direction where I ultimately ended up going, which is a bit slower. It's not, the violins aren't playing this melody, then they're just playing more of a ebbs and flows type sound, which I'll play. But again, I think the sound that they ultimately ended up going with, that is moving in the same direction. But it's even more gentle than that, really, the actual rising and falling notes that I ended up with. So these are the opening chords played by the strings from the actual piece of music, minus the flute melody. So that's, the chords that I ended up with going with, and they're just much warmer. And I think that I remember as I was sort of walking around town, or I think I was walking down by the riverbank, and I was thinking about how, the sound, the earlier quick melody that I had, it just wasn't really the sound that I was trying to go for, at least not, definitely not for the opening. I think I was at this point still obsessed with that melody, and I was like, it's going to come in later on, but it's not yet. And so I've beginning to start with that warm sound of the breeze. And I remember walking down by the riverbank, and it was sort of gentle, breezy day, and I was just watching as the tree leaves that were sort of hanging over the path, as they were just sort of bobbing up and down, just really gently swaying. It almost like looked like the trees themselves were like, when you take a deep breath in, your whole body rises, and you take a breath out, kind of looked like the trees were breathing in this weird way. And I think that's, I wanted to make the music sound like it was breathing. And that's why as well, where I've got the actual opening, I mean, the whole piece of music is in 4/4 time, apart from the opening, where it is also in 4/4 time. But then there comes this bar at the end of the phrase, which is actually in 6/4 time, because there's these two beats where no one plays anything. Because that's, when you're out and there is a slight breeze in the air, you often feel it. And then sometimes there's this little pause before the next gust comes along. And that's what I wanted to kind of create. And it only happens twice. And then after that, it just, cycles, and there's no more break. But I just wanted to create that little tiny pause bit. Yeah.
That's wonderful, Aaron. Thank you for taking us through your creative journey from creating those first ideas and melodies and palettes, and finding your way towards what you really wanted to say in the music. I think it's very instructive to hear how the ideas that are front and center when you're first creating sometimes fall away, and it's actually what was happening underneath or in the background around the edges of that first idea that end up coming to the fore. To some extent, that's a kind of the old chestnut of less is more, that it feels like you went through a process of kind of cutting away at that very busy figure that was originally on piano, and then sort of tried it out in the strings. But then once you pulled that away, you found this warmer, breathing wind texture underneath. And I also noted how the harmonics were in there from the very beginning. When you were trying out the busy melody on the first violins, violin 2 was on harmonics, and that begins the whole piece now, that kind of gentle breeze that we start off with, and that gentle breeze turns into that stronger, warm kind of wind with the full strings coming in of those chords. I also really love those dynamic pushes on the second and fourth chords of each sequence. Like when we go from the tonic chord down to the 6, the way that the dynamic just pushes feels like that next gust, that next breath of wind, kind of even though the harmony is kind of moving down, the dynamic seems to kind of move up and kind of catch you in the way that as a seed falls, it goes lower into the air and then is lifted up from underneath by that breeze. And you repeat that kind of in sequence, going from 1 to 6 and then from 4 to 2. So you have that same figure, but it has that sense of rising. So I feel like you've really found something in the dynamics of wind there. And as you say, adding in those kind of extra metrical bars, adding a bit more, adding longer bars of silence, it has that feeling of expectancy and hesitancy, and also, as you say, the in-breath or the calm between each gust of wind. I think it sets us right in the feeling of wind, and it doesn't feel like we're listening to kind of string chords in 4/4. It feels like you're kind of painting through rhythm, through those breathing dynamics, the experience of feeling wind come across you and wind lift you and drop and lift again. It's a very illuminating story of kind of cutting away and experimenting and slowing down, really listening to what you've written, but also continuing to listen to almost that inner melody that we were talking about in episode 1, like listening to that original intention and always comparing with what you're making, and almost the interplay of those two, the kind of inner imagined piece and just experimenting and chipping away at what you're actually making until the two kind of match up.
Yeah, I think that definitely listening to that original intention is what I wasn't necessarily doing with that first idea. I'd sort of latched onto this nice sounding melody, and I was, oh, this sounds really nice. It kind of does what I imagined that it probably should do, but it didn't really feel like the intention, the initial idea should have felt like. I think in the beginning, in the voice note, I talked about how the strings are doing these flowy things and stuff, but I think that actually those gestures were not the right gestures for this kind of sound which I did actually want to create, which I did sort of still feel. And I think that finding these, I mean, I do remember actually after playing around with those quick stuff, and then I wrote this sort of very simple chord sequence. I also didn't go, this is it, this is the idea. I went and did something else afterwards. I don't have that much to show you, but like I went and did something else afterwards, or played around with another thing, because again, I wasn't necessarily sold on this idea. And then it wasn't until I came back to it later on and went, oh, yes, this is the one, because I think in my head I wasn't quite, sometimes you have to go away from an idea and come back to it in order to really appreciate it, because I think I was still locked into the idea of, the earlier ideas I had, for instance, I was trying to explore. And in some ways it's like trying to force the idea in a particular direction, which actually didn't match the image that I wanted to create in the end. Whereas this one, as soon as I heard it, after a second time, I sat down again. I was like, oh, I'll listen to what I had last time. I was like, oh, actually, yeah, this really fits with the image that I want to create. And so then I was like, yes, got somewhere to start, and can kind of carry on from there. I do notice, yeah, your point about the harmonics. I did always think that even in the early version, I was like, yeah, I feel like it has to start with harmonics. I don't know why, but like, I feel like before you feel that, wind on your skin, then the harmonics do just have this sort of whistling sound to them, don't they? That I don't know whether, other composers have probably used it before to emulate, wind type sounds. But I just kind of locked in and thought, well, that is a nice idea that is gentle, and it's also, it's a very simple thing that just goes over the top of something. It's not the only thing. So, I had to find what the strings were doing underneath, and then you just sort of stick the harmonic on top as a little decoration, I suppose.
Yeah, those harmonics they're so delicate, and they feel like perhaps the faintest hint of breeze just kind of moving around the seed when it's still attached to its tree. It's just those little kind of caresses of breeze before the full wind of enough force to send the seed on its journey begins. And I suppose I'm also almost thinking about the physical space and the theatricality of having the orchestra right there. You have this full ensemble of dozens of orchestral players, and you're just starting with one section with the faintest, most delicate notes, and they're almost like they're right on the edge of not being notes. Those harmonics, are they? And I think there's something, almost kind of theatrical, dramatic about starting there with just this faintest hint and seeing how that initial breeze, that wind, is going to build and to blow across the whole orchestra, and how they each kind of respond and take up the theme. So again, treating the music itself as a kind of a flight of seeds kind of flowing across the physical space of the orchestra. Do you have that scenario in mind when you were composing this piece?
I definitely had the idea of thinking about, because I think the first idea I wrote it down on the piano, and I played it in on the piano rather, and when I tried to translate it out into the orchestra, it didn't really work, but it still sounds nice as a piano thing. Whereas with this, there's no piano there at all. I didn't even use the piano as a mock-up to do anything. I just thought, played a couple of chords in, didn't record the chords, and I was like, these are the notes that the strings will start on. And then I sort of on the computer sort of programmed in those notes for the strings to play. And so it started out as an orchestral sound rather than it starting out as a piano sound, which then kind of came out later on. And I always find that one of the things I just think it's just nicer to do that. Sometimes it can be a bit more complicated in terms of thought process, because you're like, hang on a minute, who's playing what, and you've kind of got to, when you're playing it on the piano, like you can just play it with your hands and just immediately get out that chord progression, whereas it's harder to play out the strings, for instance, all in the exact way that you want them to appear. You can get patches where you can play all of the strings with everything, but then you're not necessarily isolating which stringed which violin ones and violin twos and violas, who's exactly playing what. And that was quite important to me. And so, yeah, I think that having that orchestral sound to start with is kind of what I was intentionally creating with this version.
Yes, and as a piano player, I really hear what you're saying about the piano being both a wonderful tool for arranging. My piano teacher always used to say, you have an orchestra at your fingertips when you're playing the piano, which is true to an extent, but also it makes me think of that phrase from Berlioz, who obviously wrote the book on orchestration, and how he really disliked using the piano, and he felt he could always tell when a composer had started at the piano, and he said that he thought the piano led composers into all kinds of errors of orchestration, and he said, just forget the piano and start with the orchestral sounds that you're working with. And I think it all depends how you use the piano and how you, if you do start there, how you translate and transition over. But it's very interesting in terms of this creative process to note that you developed an idea on piano that was eventually cut, and that the experimenting and playing with orchestral textures around that initial idea were actually the seed of what is in the finished piece. There's something quite concrete and quite literal about orchestration, that you have to just keep listening to the actual interplay and the effects created by writing for those instruments. I know that you're mainly a trumpeter when you were playing, weren't you?
Yeah, I grew up playing the trumpet and the cornet for a long time. Played that from about the age of sort of 6 to like 18. And I found that when I started composing, one of the first things I said to myself was, well, if I want to learn composition, then I need to learn to play the piano, because the piano is kind of a composer's tool, I suppose. I'm not a pianist, and even the piano sound I play to you, that's not actually me playing it live. I've just probably played in the chords underneath, and I've drawn in with the tool and Logic all the run notes. And I find that I do use the piano when I'm composing, but it'll mostly be kind of finding simple melodies and finding different chord sequences. It's rare that I ever actually write anything fully fleshed out on the piano, and my piano skills are quite poor, really, and that's why in some ways I like doing the orchestral stuff where you can just dive straight in. And even when I use the piano to play in just with one hand or different instruments while they're playing, I'll play it in in one take type thing, and then once I've got that take, I'll just dive straight into the actual notes, move them around and reposition them, and then copy that instrument onto another line, alter those to say that the chord is slightly different, and I'll flesh it out that way. So for me, piano isn't it's a tool to get the notes on the paper. It's not anything else. But I do find that sometimes without that structure to begin with, without the chord sequence, without the melody, or without any time, the piano is really good for a sketch, and if you haven't got that, sometimes you're like, well, what am I drawing? I don't necessarily know. You're just sort of going straight in there with some paint or some ink, and you're like, don't know what it is. And in some ways, that's one of the things I really like about doing arranging, is that someone's already given you that structure, and so you just sort of decorate it with these lush textures around it. Whereas when you're the composer as well, then you're having to either sketch it out on the piano beforehand, or sketch it in the orchestra as you're going along. So you're kind of painting and sketching at the same time. And that's kind of what the thing was I kind of did with this piece, was that it was very much sometimes when I get to the end of a section, I'd just play the chords in for the next sequence on the piano and see kind of where it was going. And then once I got those, I'd immediately just like, right, where do I map these into the orchestra? What are the players doing? And often it would just be like block chords I'd be playing. So I'd be just playing like dun 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 dun, that kind of thing. Whereas the actual movements in the string section, or whoever's playing the harmonic stuff, really wouldn't be that. So it very much is just like the piano just says, here you're playing A minor, and when you orchestrate your notes, make sure that it sounds in tune with what the piano is playing, so it's just sort of, it's almost like the conductor beating the baton in order to keep you in time. Like the piano just keeps me in tune, I suppose. So
that sounds like a very good use of the piano in orchestration, and I think even Berlioz couldn't object to that. That's I always wondered if it's just because someone once said something not very nice about his piano playing, and he was sort of bore a grudge against the instrument ever since. We'll never know.
No.
But, so we've found this wind texture, and it's these warm, breathy, rising chords. I mean, we're saying harmonically sometimes they're moving down, but in terms of the dynamic, it's got this swell and this sense of rising to it. That's really fundamental to the piece. You found the wind first, and I suppose you almost found the wind before you found the seed, in that the wind is the kind of instigator. The wind is the force behind all of the action of the piece. So where do you go after that, when you've found this wind texture? What's next? What was the next beat of this story that you're telling?
I think the next thing was like, I mean, that first sound I have, it's a gentle breeze, isn't it? And I think the next stage for me was, how do you then, which was an easier step. That first step was quite, it was a challenge to get there, and took some time to get there. But once I'd found it, the next step was a little bit easier, where it was, okay, well, the wind is no longer, it's gentle, it's sort of picking up a bit, it wants to be a little bit more going on there in order to carry the seed on a different journey. And so I just sort of played around with these different textures. I think it's the same chord pattern. I'll play a bit of tune now. So that kind of is it's the same chord pattern, so it's the same chord sequence as the previous one, but the strings are moving a bit more. It even has the same dynamic markings, it's a rise and fall, ebb and flow type thing, but there's a bit more movement going on. And I've kind of got this, the cellos are playing this, it's kind of melodic-ish line. Let me play a little bit. And then the violas on top of that are playing, something that's sort of twice as quick. So and I think just layering those up like that, for me, just sort of created this thing where, there's more going. It's no longer a gentle breeze. It's getting a little bit more, not furious, but heading in that direction. And I think also it's a more of an unstable feel, perhaps that's the right word, because the cello line, I think also I was imagining it to be like almost like a stormy motif, and so I think I then tried to explore that idea and thought, oh, maybe then the bassist can play that as well, and then maybe later on we can have, it's a stormy motif. So I've got this gentle breeze motif, and now I've got this stormy motif, and those will be the things that lie underneath what the melodic material is doing. And I think up to this point, I then started to play around a little bit with some melodic material on top, but very much I'd sort of locked into, well, those are the two underlying foundations which I have to play with at the moment before I explore anywhere else.
I love that sense of growing force of the wind, and as you say, it's the interplay. It's not that as the wind gets stronger, it just gets kind of faster or more manic. It's got something very strong and kind of pulsing underneath those really smooth crotchets, and the faster viola line on top is one of the effects of that strong kind of, like the underwind, for want of a better term. But there's kind of an underwind and an overwind, and it's starting to split into kind of many voices, and perhaps the wind is kind of meeting different textures as well. I mean, when I was looking through the score, I almost felt that those lower string lines are sometimes the wind meeting the trunk or the branches, but whatever the wind meets, it almost takes on the form of that texture, and we're moving towards it meeting the seeds, which are so small and delicate in comparison. But the wind is kind of, I mean, it's polyphonic. It's got all those different textures kind of happening at once. Thank you so much for taking us through the way that the wind is developing, because I love this. It feels like a very cinematic sensibility to be taking to this image of the seed being detached from the tree. I feel like we're kind of following the storyboard almost now as we talk about your creative process. Like you're finding each new beat of the story of the wind meeting the seed. For me, listening to these early sections, it felt like the flute was where we first meet the seed itself. Does that track to where you were, to what you were imagining, or is the flute another voice of the wind still at this point?
I think it does track with where I was thinking at this point. When you have the opening of the actual piece, it has this nice flute melody that I didn't imagine to be representing the seed. That for me came in nearer the end, where, because at the start it was literally just these chords that the strings were playing underneath, and then I think when the first violins dropped out of the harmonics, the pattern sort of repeated, and they would then play this nice luscious melody, and then later on, when the stormy sort of motif came in, then the flute would come in and the woodwind would come in, and they would be this lighter sound which would represent the seed. But it wasn't until later on, I think, when I got further down the composition process with the piece, that actually I was like, oh, hang on a minute, the beginning, I think it needs a little bit extra, something extra at the beginning, which is where I then decided that, this flute melody would go on top of it. I mean, I wasn't necessarily thinking that this is, the wind theme or whatever. It was just needs a little something decorative on top. So it needs a little melody to introduce you to the piece, and it needs some melody that carries on and comes back later on. And I felt like the flute has this nice soft sort of sound that would just sit quite nicely. So that's kind of where I came to that idea. But definitely kind of later on, I've got another clip here I can show you where this is the first ideas where I had of the actual seed taking place. I think you'll hear the ending of the previous section as well. So all that kind of woodwind stuff that's going on is, representative of the seed and it falling out of the tree. And at that point, it's this feather-shaped seed. We've not yet got to the helicopter seeds. Yes. It just sort of falls out of the. I mean, from the video, I remember watching it. Kind of looks a little bit like when you drop a piece of paper and it sort of whooshes around and it floats and it whooshes and it floats, and then it starts. And once it's done that a couple of times, then this feather seed then just starts to go, because and that's where you've got these sort of hovering trills and stuff going on, which do make it into the finished piece in a slightly different. Some of the components all wiggled around a little bit, but they're all there really.
Yes, and some of that movement I think is captured in those descending kind of arpeggios as well. Da 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 da. Like it's movement downwards, but it's delicate. It's a delicate falling. It registers as quite playful after these warm, quite elemental chords. I suppose literally elemental, because it's the wind coming in, and it's the way that the wind has kind of like almost tickled these seeds off branches, and they're falling down in a way that's kind of a bit more sprightly. And the trills, I'm starting to hear like this accumulation of falling seeds. Like we're kind of growing into the theme now of seeds starting to fly and to fall. And we're also meeting the woodwind section. So talk me through your approach to the woodwind writing, because that's been in there right from the start when we were listening to that voice note, and you're referencing Ravel's woodwind arrangements and textures, and the way that lines kind of dance and play with each other. Is that a kind of a technique and a texture that is particularly effective in woodwind, do you think? And what's your approach?
I think it was, if you remember, I talked about cascading woodwinds. And so I think for me, it was very much like whenever the seed's up high, it's going to play by the flute. And whenever it's moving, it can move down the registers through the woodwind section. I don't think in the end piece I was quite as literal as that, but definitely there's an element to the cascading woodwind where you've got these sort of falling patterns that overlap in terms of moving from the flutes to the clarinets, for instance. And it's something that I have emphasized more. Like, for instance, this opening bit which we listened to a second ago, I'll play it again with it just with the woodwind. The end doesn't quite get to where it ultimately ends up going, but most of that's still there. It's fleshed out even further in the finished version, and it has this just this cascading effect where it's moving from the flutes downwards towards the oboes and the clarinets. I think here the bassoon's actually doubling what the cellos are playing, so it's locking into that sort of stormy motif. I say stormy, it's not really stormy, but it's less gentle. It's a good way to think about it. I was kind of thinking a stormy type thing, but yeah, I think that the cascading woodwinds and very much how other composers use them and sort of weave them into each other, and I think it's that combination sometimes here, not so much, but definitely later on, where we've got these sort of really sort of quick runs, which are scale runs, which are going all over the place. That was very much where I was thinking about the layers of, hang on a minute, which woodwind instrument gets paired with who next, and it has to sort of build. So eventually sort of they're all kind of playing, but there's the combinations. It's not always the same combination. Every phrase is a slightly different combination. So it has this feeling that it's sort of just shifting slightly, and it's transforming slightly as well.
Yes. Keeping that quality of wind where things they twist and switch positions, and we're hearing that kind of vortex that could be whipped up by wind, even a fairly gentle breeze. Like on an autumn days, it turns sort of loose leaves on the ground into this great kind of flurrying circle, and it doesn't take all that much wind to do it, but it feels very stormy. It feels like the prelude to a storm. And the doubling of the cello and bassoon there is so strong. Like it's got a really kind of rising supportive quality, I suppose, with the bassoon coming in and coming up to meet the rest of the woodwinds. I'm aware that so far, like we're also talking almost kind of chronologically through the piece. Is this still the chronology of your process, or do we jump around in the piece in terms of what you were writing next? Were you sort of finding themes that end up being in a middle or a later section, or are you writing it? Is your creative process also in sync with the chronology of the piece?
I think mostly it was chronological. Definitely up to this point, there was the opening sort of swells that are going on, and then the woodwind came in here. The next bit, I think, was something that ultimately I think it ended up moving further back in the piece of music, because I just really liked this trumpet sound, like the trumpet paired with the violins. I just thought was a really nice sound, and I think ultimately it ended up being slightly later in the piece. Yeah, so that bit, came after those flute little bits, whereas actually in the end it got moved further back because it didn't feel quite like it was. I really liked that sound, I really liked that text, I really liked the theme, but I just felt like in some ways it just felt a bit boring. It just kind of felt like I'd lost interest listening to that point. I was like, no, I lost interest now. And so I was like, I need to retain my own interest, let alone the listener's interest. So I was like, but at the same time, I really loved it. And I was like, I really love the pairing of the sound, the melody's nice, but I think that whole phrase was just a bit too long in some ways for it to be that next bit. And so I ended up not getting rid of it, but I was like, I'll save that till later, and maybe I'll be able to do something with it a bit later on. So then I sort of, came up with the next section, which was a bit more soaring. The seed is free, it's been let loose, it's on its own voyage now, it's off, it's taken flight. And the next bit of the piece was very much about that journey. And then later on, I came back to that trumpet motif, that trumpet sound with the strings that's playing there. But I also layered over the top of it these really fast, woodwind scale runs which are going on, which ultimately they sound similar to those original ideas which I had on the piano of what I thought the wind might sound like. And actually, that's what I mean, where that idea that I had originally didn't end up in the piece, but there are similarities between it, because those quick runs which was played on the piano, which were meant to actually represent the wind, ended up not the same runs, but the similar movements and style ended up being in there, but they're actually representing the seed movements in the sky as it's on this sort of playful journey. So that was quite nice in some ways to, I don't necessarily think I can necessarily consciously revisited it, but it's interesting, looking back now, you can sort of see the parallels between them.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's another really instructive point for composers and maybe for creative people in general, that an idea that doesn't work in its original context isn't necessarily a bad idea that you need to throw away and never come back to. It's really worth keeping in mind everything that's gone before, and not erasing, but kind of putting into the yet to use pile. And you never know what might come back in a very different form. I'm also interested in how ideas start to be generated by your own sense of boredom. I think that's a really important thing to note, that you're also encountering your own piece as the very first audience, as the first listener. It could be putting on your layperson ears and sort of say, I wasn't really captured by that. I wasn't moved beyond there. I wanted something new to happen. And you can also put yourself in the role of critic and kind of having more specific or kind of technical feedback to kind of give yourself, and how that's very generative, because when you give your composer self those that feedback and those impressions, then sometimes that can make sense of ideas that didn't have a place so far. But you think, oh, well, if that's a kind of a sticking point or a bit of a roadblock in the piece, I can get around that by bringing in this or this idea that's been floating around. I just didn't know where it should go. So that's some kind of, I guess, very creative level kind of impressions of what you've been saying. And then just to add, like on the technical level, it sounds like for this piece, it's not only the texture and the color, which we've been talking about since the inception of the piece, but it starts to become a rhythmic form of variation, that you have these long and epic and warm lines and strings, and you found that trumpet legato that kind of answers or builds upon that very long legato string texture. But the woodwinds are bringing in something completely different. They're syncopating, and they're quick and playful, and you're starting to build those kind of those contrasts, and it feels like the rhythmic contrasts are really key for how the piece moves, which kind of makes sense given that it's a piece that's all about movement and variety of movement that the wind can bring on to the seeds.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep it moving for sure. Once we've had the, gentle warm breeze motif, we've had the stormy motif, then the strings kind of move into this different pattern, which I think I've got here. Which is sort of, we've sort of left behind that gentle breeze now feeling, and now it's focusing on the thing that I want the listener to hear now is the melody of the soaring thing that's going on, which I think is played actually by, let me play that little clip again, you can hear it. So there's this melody that's sort of passed, it's not the same melody that's passed between them, but, the violins have melodic material, then the horns, then the trumpets, and it's sort of passed around these three key players. But around that, you've got to have, movement and a driving force. And so I think at that point, I was thinking, right, the focus now is on the melody. We're with the seed, we're soaring with it. We've forgotten about the wind. We're just going for a nice ride now. And so the strings then, they're taking this more rhythmic approach. Where it's like dun 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 dun, which is more of an excitement, sort of driving force that's going. And then, we're sort of with that then for a little bit of time on the journey. And I think going back to what you said about boredom in the piece of music, how do you tackle that? I said that I moved that trumpet legato further back in the piece, and I was like, I don't know what to do with that yet. I like it, but it doesn't go here because I'm bored by it, so I have to push it further back. And then this is, where I came up with this material here, which is, this lovely melodic material where the seed's soaring and stuff. And I found that for me, when I feel like I've made a good piece of music, is when it gives me goosebumps. And that for me was a moment, when I was like, I've got goosebumps now, so I know it's good, and I think that in some ways you have to be your own critic, like you said, and you have to, and if you think your piece is boring or mediocre, then, you probably need to keep working at it, and maybe it's not going in the right direction. Maybe you need to change direction, which is where we, scrapped that first idea and was like, this idea is not working, no matter how hard I try, I can't make anything out of it. So we'll move on to something else, and it's this crafting process that's just ongoing. And, landing on this idea, that was when I was like, yes, this is a great moment within the piece of music, and I need to keep it going. And I think even after that point, like once you've had that bit of time where you think, oh, this bit of music's giving me goosebumps, this is a great bit, and then it just stops because you haven't written the rest of the music, and you're like, oh, okay, I've got to try and continue that feeling somehow now, and I've got to try and it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but like that feeling of greatness where like or feeling of, at a certain level, you've set the bar with that moment, and now you have to either match it or raise it from then onwards. You can't let it drop, let it fall.
I think that is a wonderful place to end episode 2, the goosebump test. Follow your own sense of goosebumps as well as your own sense of boredom and what's missing. And once you've raised the bar to that sense of something really great happening, keep on building and trying to raise that bar and clear it as you move through the piece. All really rich, interesting lessons to draw from talking about your creative process, Aaron. So thank you so much. That was episode 2 of Composer's Journey from Inspiration to Creation. In episode 3, we're going to talk about melody, melodic construction, and we will continue to move through the piece and to move through Aaron's creative process in making Flight of the Seeds. Aaron, thank you so much.
Thank you.